But I had to absolutely be at that place in order to have that level of surrender to even entertain the idea of becoming sober.
This podcast is sponsored by Casamara Club. Casamara Club makes refreshing, aromatic botanical sodas with a clean, extra dry finish. You can find Casamara Club sodas in Michelin star restaurants, cozy neighborhood bars, and specialty shops, or online at casamaraclub.com. But today, they sent us some of their flagship soda, Alta, to try. They say it's an Italian-style aperitivo with a blend of Italian citrus and spices. Should we open these up and see for ourselves? Welcome to Comeback Kid. This is a podcast about addiction and recovery, and we are here with Fiona Silver. Fiona, how are you?
Hey, I'm great. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Good. Sunny day in LA.
Yeah.
Was music always a part of your journey, or did that come into the picture later?
I didn't start playing till I was like maybe 13, but I always loved music. My dad had a great record collection, and I just remember it being like very much a part of life, you know, like driving in the car, like whatever, always the soundtrack was there. And then I had an older brother who played guitar. And so that was kind of the thing, the catalyst that got me into it. I was like, I want to play too.
It's when I started drinking and kind of like got into the throes of my addiction. The sort of magical worlds that I created when I was a kid got really, really dark. And but it's still this like form of escapism, right? Because for me, music was always like a really healthy form of escapism. And then that kind of translated into escapism in a different way. Do you relate to that? What is your relationship with escapism?
I feel like escapism is a huge part of addiction. You want that trapdoor to like leave the present moment and to eject out of reality. And there's so many ways that I think, you know, creativity is like this bridge between, you know, imagination and like dream worlds and reality, and how we like bring that back down to earth and like to other people and ourselves, you know?
Mm-hmm. It gets tough when there's sort of an overlap between if your addiction is kind of fueling the music, it gets hard to like make that distinction as clearly. When you were in active addiction, were you pursuing music as well, or did that kind of happen in recovery?
Well, first of all, my addiction was not linear, right? So there were times where it kind of like was worse, and then times where I like reeled it in, and then so it was like that. But when I started performing, I was so nervous. Like I had such terrible stage fright that I never, like I would be sick before shows. And like, so I actually didn't use before performing because I was so crazy out of my head anyway. It was actually not at all a part of like a ritual. Like I know a lot of people have like rituals before they perform or whatever. And that just like wasn't part of it for me at all. But I will say in terms of obviously like being at home alone and writing and things like that, you know, I was high all the time. So it just was there, but I didn't connect it as like, oh, I need this thing to then do this other thing, you know? It was kind of like both things just existed simultaneously.
Right. Interesting that you didn't use it to overcome stage fright though. So how did you overcome the stage fright?
Yeah, I just kept, I don't know, I just did it until it wore off, you know?
Yeah.
I just pushed myself through it. Very much like recovery, you know, where like in the beginning, it felt absolutely horrendous and nerve-wracking. And, but I knew it was something that like was good for me and that I wanted. And then, you know, through repetition and new experiences, it gets less nerve-wracking and more natural, you know?
how did you know? Did you have that kind of resistance of, I'm sure you had periods of, not wanting to do it or maybe not, but I had periods of not wanting to do it, even though I kind of knew this is something I had to do. But how did you know that this is something that at that time you had to do?
I was so spiritually, emotionally broken, unfortunately. But I had to absolutely be at that place in order to have that level of surrender to even entertain the idea of becoming sober. It was kind of simple in a way because I just knew that the other way was not working for me anymore. And so there was no like illusion anymore that it could be the same. Like it just wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there definitely have been times, and still to this day, where I'm like, question, and now it's, the longer time that one has, I think, time shifts things. And because I got sober young, relatively, I was 24, that's been an interesting mechanism where sometimes my mind will say, you were just young and it was just a difficult time in your life. And, now you know so much more and you've gone through, therapy and all this kind of stuff and you're a different person. Like, surely you could have a cocktail,
Right. Yeah.
So those thoughts definitely creep up. And to be honest, like, I can't say 1,000%. And this is just my experience. I know a lot of people that are like, oh no, I know for sure, I don't know for sure. And I have to live with that and be okay with that. Like, just for today, that like what I've gained in recovery is just so much deeper and more enriching in my life than like being able to have a glass of wine, or you know what I mean? It's just the trade-off. Even if everything would be quote unquote fine, what I would lose is just not worth it,
Right. It's not about that glass of wine. It's about so much more. But that's interesting. I mean, I think there is this concept of specifically just being able to have a glass of wine, like with dinner or something. What is that about? Like, why are we fixated on having a glass of wine?
I mean, I certainly can't speak for anyone else, but for me, wine is a tricky thing because, well, first of all, I love wine.
Yeah, me too.
Which feels funny because it's like, duh, of course. But like I never drank, not that I never drank, I drank beer, but like I wasn't into beer. Mm-hmm. I would always drink hard alcohol or like, wine.
Mm-hmm.
And my father was a chef and he was from a young age, it really was something that I was taught was like an important thing in a way. And like this, like he took me to vineyards in Spain and like it actually was like this like culturally enriching aspect that I can appreciate now from afar, sadly. But, yeah. I think there is that sense of like wine is viewed as a little more classy, a little more like you're not just like brown bagging it, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's a symbol, I think, of moderation in a way,
What do you think a cocktail is a symbol of?
A good time.
Good time. I have this idea that a cocktail, at least when I was underage drinking, a cocktail symbolized maturity and adulthood and being able to go to a bar and order a cocktail. I felt like this sense of I'm an adult. I was like 19.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it was hard to give that up.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's something that's so perpetuated by Hollywood, right? Like you see these images in movies and TV where you know, like I think immediately of like Sex in the City or something where it's like, you know, it's very much shown as like, oh, like, yeah, these mature ladies go out and like have their martinis or whatever.
Right.
And it's like, who cared? Like, I wouldn't have wanted a martini anyway. But like, yeah, there's something about the glass itself and like the combination of things that feels more sophisticated than like having a shot or something.
Of course, which has a different symbolism, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah. It's interesting how we ascribe these kind of symbolism to different kinds of drugs or alcohol, and it can be hard to overcome that when getting sober. So what was it like for you? Did you have like a pink clown moment in the beginning?
Sadly, no.
Okay.
And I think it's amazing that so many people do. And that like brings me so much joy just to watch other people like lighten up and have this amazing experience in the beginning of sobriety. But for me, I was in the process of grieving my father's death. And
sorry.
It's okay. And I just had a lot going on in my life and I was super stressed out. I had actually inherited a bar in Brooklyn,
Wow.
which was a whole other crazy situation. And I was in a difficult relationship with someone else who was just getting sober, who actually was kind of the reason, like that was how I came in, was an ultimatum of like, hey, I'm going to relapse if I stay with you. So like, I think I have to end this. And I was so, you know, it's interesting, you know, we talk about like character defects or like character defenses. And there's like this flip side sometimes where those things can, not that, you know, as we go into recovery, obviously we work through it and we learn like better coping mechanisms. But at the time, my codependency actually saved me because I would absolutely not have stopped at that time. But I was so terrified of losing this person that and I knew that I wasn't really getting anything out of using and drinking anymore. And in the past, if that came up, I would have been like, okay, bye, you know? But that particular moment in my life, I was like, I'll do anything. Okay, I'll stop, you know?
Right.
And I did.
So how did you shift from doing it for that person to finding your own purpose and reason for staying sober?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like it was there all along underneath, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise I wouldn't have done it. But I didn't have that, like I think of it like a layer, like that was the top layer, was me doing it for someone else and like this sort of external validation of like, okay, I have this relationship, I have this person, so I'm okay. I was definitely not okay, but you know. But what happened was, which was really important, like we weren't like our processes where we went and like what we did to recover were completely separate. And that's so important because then I was able to develop friendships and relationships and really have my own experience and not be unfocused, you know, not worried about what someone else is thinking or feeling or reacting in a moment. I was totally just in my own experience. And very quickly, you know, I felt so connected, even though I was still learning what it was, you know, and feeling really shy. And I wasn't someone who like automatically said hello to people or anything like that. You know, I was very like come at the last second, leave, like first person to leave, you know, all that stuff. But I felt the kind of magic that was there. And I loved it. So I knew that like I needed it and it was working for me. So it just kind of gradually, naturally happened where, and then by the time, of course, like that relationship was a nightmare. and we broke up and it wasn't at all connected to him, which I'm so grateful for, that I wasn't like, oh, well, now this is gone too, Like I was like, oh, absolutely not. This is mine,
Yeah. How did you know that it was working, that sobriety was working for you?
Well, I had never been able to stop on my own. And so that was a pretty clear-cut distinction.
Yeah. Had you tried to stop on your own?
Yes and no. I had tried to manage. So, like, I'm just not going to do this drug, or I'm just going to do, I tried to like calculate what I thought would be okay for me, or I'm just not going to do this tonight. And then, of course, I would, that kind of stuff. But I never wanted to be sober. So it never occurred to me to stop everything completely.
Right. Yeah, I definitely had thoughts of it like about a year before I finally got sober. But I looked at my schedule and I said, but I'm getting drinks with this person on Monday and this person on Wednesday and this person on Thursday. So I have to drink if I'm getting drinks with somebody, right?
Of course. Only logical.
It felt impossible.
Yeah.
It really did. What motivates you now in your sobriety? Like, how do you sustain your sobriety?
So many things. Really connecting with other people is, I think, at the forefront, not only helping others and like being able to be of service to others, but also just feeling a part of something that's bigger than me and allowing others to show up for me as well,
Yeah. Have you had moments of feeling like very alone in your sobriety? Because I've gone through, I feel like, harder times sober than I did when I was drinking. And sometimes I've just felt so alone and had to like come to the conclusion I need to like really reconnect and make an effort. Have you had that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of always feel connected at large, but I've definitely had experiences that are, I think, like you're saying, like very directly connected to my own isolation, where, I feel that and it's only natural. And then I'm like, okay, I have to actually make an effort to like crawl out of this hole and, be a part of the group, not only in my mind, but in reality.
I relate to that. Yeah, totally. So now in your life, what are some habits you have or resources you use to stay present and sober and sane and all of those good things?
Yeah. Well, yes. Same, like first and foremost is just community, like, and by that too, I mean like real friends too, just people that are so ingrained in my life that I call and that I speak to that are also sober, and obviously meetings, but also meditation is extremely helpful for me, in terms of, honestly, it's connected to sobriety, but I think of it as so much bigger than that. Like, kind of like we were saying before, like it's not just about not drinking or using drugs. It's also like, what is my spiritual condition, And that question can lead me towards a drink and drug if I'm not doing real well. But at this point, I've stacked so many habits and created such a huge wall in my life between like that dark side and where I live today that I would really have to backpedal on a lot of what is now like my normal life to get back to that place. Which is not to say that that can't happen very quickly. Like, certainly don't want to be arrogant about that. And also, I will say, I have to remember, like, I one time went to the dentist and something just came over me, and it felt like the most wild thing because I'm like, oh, like, I have all these years, like, I'm so sober. It was like that addictive, like, little monster woke up inside of me, and I was like, can I go under? Like, can you just, like, knock me out for this?
Yeah.
And they were like, no, like, this is not that kind of deal. Like, what are you talking about? And I was like, oh, okay. And then they offered to give me pain medication afterwards, and I never picked it up. And I'm glad that I didn't, which is not to say that anyone shouldn't do that at all. Like, obviously, doctor's orders, do whatever you need to do. But for me, I knew I didn't need it, and that would be me opening a door, and sort of weaseling my way into something that I really did not want to go down, didn't want to enter that road. So yeah, it's a pretty wild thing that it can kind of happen like that too.
What do you say to that voice, that little monster? What do you say to it when it's kind of creeping in?
Yeah, that was my only experience that was so consuming like that really, like, threw me off guard. I think that's where, like, the idea of a spiritual pause really comes in, where it's like, let me just not do anything right now, because, like, my first instinct is gonna be bad. So I just gotta, like, breathe, sit on my hands, and then, what would be good is to connect with another person who is in recovery in that, in a situation like that, and, like, talk it out, because things in our own minds can sound like a really good idea sometimes. And then when we say it out loud to someone else who actually knows the deal, it very quickly loses steam,
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I had a moment recently when I found this amazing shop near where I live, which sells non-alcoholic beverages, but some of them have a little alcohol. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of curious about these beverages, and I had to be really honest with myself about why are you kind of digging here? Like, what is this about, really? And, I stick to the zero ABV, but it takes a second of just kind of talking to that voice and being like, what is this really about? Like, why are you showing up right now? And what is this? So I'm also curious what your thoughts are on kind of like non-alcoholic cocktails, mocktails.
It's such an interesting thing because I'm not, like, on one side about it, pro or anti. I kind of think, obviously everyone is in charge of their own choices, and and I don't view them as a bad thing, but I can see how it, depending on, like you said, like, what's really behind this, I can see it being a slippery slope in a way. But that's all about the intention. Like, it could absolutely not be that. And I personally love having a mocktail, and because it's like that thing we were talking about, the symbolism, right? It's like I can maintain this symbol that brings me a sense of joy or whatever, and not have any of the negative side effects, I think that's pretty cool. But if I'm doing that, which, I think some people are kind of white knuckling it, and they're like, really want the drink. And then they're just telling themselves, well, this is okay. But then it's like, I've seen that happen with people where I know that that's just a stepping stone, Yeah.
You can kind of like smell the intention.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. I want to talk a little bit about your music because you had a new single come out, Vertigo, and I love it. You have this amazing feminine energy in your music. Was that always part of it? And I know you've talked a little bit about overcoming stage fright, and how do you harness that power and how do you bring that into your music?
Thank you. So funny. I never thought about my music as being feminine. I guess it's just a byproduct of being who I am, maybe. I feel like, I don't know. It just, I feel like when I make music, that's just me in this in this like certain form, you know? It doesn't feel like I have to necessarily like draw it in or like put like an act on or, you know. But I will say it can be fun to, just in terms of also writing songs and, you know, thinking of different scenarios that could just be fun, you know, like with that song and with this whole EP that I'm like rolling out now. The idea was I wanted to make music that was inspired by these 60s films and had this kind of noir and like spy film. Like I was looking at a lot of old movie posters and thinking about sort of like 007 films and these like Italian like landscapes, and I don't know, it was a fun, not a character to get into, but like a world to get into, you know?
Yeah, that's really interesting. What's the next step?
So, well, I don't know when this podcast come out, but next week I'm releasing another song called L'Assassin, which is another, you know, Vertigo, funnily enough, actually stemmed from a real life experience. I was having vertigo.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. And it was very trippy. Like it actually brought me back to feeling like fucked up. Like it felt
Really?
like when you're really drunk and high at the same time and like everything's like spinning. Mm-hmm. And I was literally just sitting on the couch one day and I had this experience and it freaked me out so much. I was like, and then of course I like went to doctors and I was like, what's wrong with me? And they were like, oh, this is like just a little crystal in your ear. It's like a totally normal thing. But yeah, that was kind of a wild experience that made me, I was like, I need to write a song about this. And yeah, and then it was interesting that I was inspired by those posters, but I had never seen that Hitchcock film. So then people brought that to my attention and now I have to see it, obviously.
It's a fantastic film. I think you'd really enjoy it. Yeah. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear what's next.
Thanks.
Yeah, super exciting. 2 more questions. Where can we listen to your music and support you?
So all the usual spots, Apple Music and Spotify and, you know, whatever your pleasure may be. Bandcamp is definitely the most direct way to like support artists. But yeah, Spotify and Apple are great. And, you know, that's probably the main spots.
Instagram?
Instagram for sure. Yeah.
What is your Instagram?
It's just my name, Fiona Silver.
Okay, awesome. And then last question, because this is Comeback Kid. What does the idea of being a comeback kid mean to you? And in what ways are you a comeback kid?
I love that name, by the way.
Thank you.
I mean, it definitely, even like the imagery of the boxing gloves and everything, it draws to mind, you know, being a fighter, which I think, you know, comes from adversity in a lot of ways. And this idea that like you can be beaten down sometimes by life, but not killed. And you can come back and, you know, fight another day and maybe win sometimes.
That would be nice.
Yeah, that would be great. I never thought about myself that way, but I do actually really identify with that. And I would venture to say that probably anyone who is sober could relate to that, you know. But also not just sobriety. Like there's so many ways in which people go through difficult things in life and then overcome them, you know. And I think that's such a beautiful part of life and like a beautiful way to connect with other people and help other people. Like I feel very informed by my experience with grief. And, you know, I'm glad to say it's not something that I think about all the time or that I like carry as like a burden with me anymore. But there was a time when I did, you know, when I came in, right, like a year after my father passed away. And then 2 years into sobriety, my brother died.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And from drugs and alcohol.
Okay.
And that was really tough, you know, and that almost took me out. But like the people literally in recovery that I knew saved me from that and like kept me close. And I was able to process that like trauma and grief just by having a safe space to talk about it, you know? So I don't know. I think there's so many ways that outside of just like drinking and using, like I feel like a lot of us and myself for sure, that's kind of like a symptom of the issue, you know? It's not necessarily, not to say that it's not an issue, but like there's a lot of stuff happening beneath the surface that would lead me towards that, you know? And to be able to like address those deeper things is like incredible.
You are a comeback kid.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. This podcast is sponsored by Kathy Martins. Thanks, Kathy.